Now, you may not have expected it, but as we just declared by putting this chapter first, the most important consideration an armed American can make when selecting a handgun for self-defense is quality. How high or low of quality that handgun is. That's the most important thing you can think about. The reason for that, the reason why quality is more important than accuracy or anything, or power, the reason quality is the most important is because quality drives reliability. And reliability is king when we're talking about a self-defense handgun. Reliability is the first job of your handgun. Without reliability, nothing else matters. It doesn't matter how big or how powerful the bullet is that your handgun's firing or how accurate it is. If it doesn't go bang when you pull the trigger, that weapon is useless. So clearly, reliability is everything. I mean, it really is everything. But the problem here is we can't just go to a gun store and ask the clerk behind the counter, no matter how seasoned he is, hey, how reliable is this handgun? Or how reliable is this handgun? We can't ask that and expect a good answer. We can't. Because the fact of the matter is, reliability is mostly anecdotal when you're asking other people. The only true way to measure a handgun's reliability is to take it to a range and fire 1, 2, or 3,000 rounds from that weapon and see how many times it malfunctions. That's the only way. Obviously, that is exceedingly impractical for most people. When we're trying to decide on a gun for home defense or concealed carry, we can't afford to buy a gun brand new, buy $600, $700 worth of ammunition for that gun, take it to the range, shoot it all, and then say, okay, yeah, this gun was reliable, I can use this gun. Or, no, this gun jammed more than Pat's recommended threshold, which we're going to get to in just a moment. And so, no, I can't use this gun. And then we go buy another gun. It's not going to happen. Nobody does that. The good news is we can make a very educated attempt at knowing just how reliable a handgun is before we even pick it up in the gun store. And we're going to make that educated estimate, which is going to be 99% accurate, using the strategies that we're about to talk about. And as I said in the beginning, the handgun characteristic that has by far the greatest effect on that weapon's reliability is its quality. How well that weapon was manufactured, how good the materials used were, and how good its design is. Now here's something we all have to keep in mind, not just here in this chapter on quality, but forever, for as long as we stay involved in the gun space at all. But that is that gun manufacturers are businesses. I love business, but they are businesses, and their one goal is to turn a profit. So they're going to try to give you the guns that you want, not necessarily the guns that you need, right? Who makes more money, do you think, in this country? People selling ice cream or people selling broccoli? Probably people selling ice cream. Well, that's important, and it's the same way in the gun industry. You see, we need a gun that's reliable beyond any doubt. But oftentimes we want guns that are small enough to fit in our pockets. We want guns that are as thin as our wallets. We want guns that don't kick when we shoot them. But we don't realize just how much we're sacrificing in terms of quality when we buy a gun based solely on one or two factors. There's no shame in admitting that we all want to carry a gun that is comfortable. And we can sacrifice on quality and get comfort like that, as you're about to see. However, we cannot sacrifice quality. Remember, that's the whole point of these 15 characteristics that we got to evaluate in the order we're doing them in. The first 5, but especially the first 3, should never, ever, ever be compromised on. We should never budge on these things. And so the fact that quality is appearing first, that tells you just how important it is. We should never sacrifice quality. And so that begs the question, let's dive in. When you're standing in a gun store looking at some weapons, how do you accurately predict that gun's reliability? The gun industry is old enough now, and it's been around long enough, so that companies that produce weapons of vastly inferior quality just don't stick around for very long. They don't last long because a gun has to be past a certain point of reliability in order for it to be able to stand the test of time. And so there are some manufacturers out there who have been around a long time who would never sacrifice their reputation by producing a gun that doesn't rise above those base level standards. But the problem that we have to consider is that it's relatively easy to produce a handgun that performs reliably in the sterile environment of an indoor gun range when it's freshly oiled and freshly cleaned. That's not that hard. The difficult thing comes when you're trying to produce a handgun that will perform reliably in the worst of environments, when it's packed with sand, when it's caked with mud, or just even to point out some things that you're going to have to deal with if you're going to carry concealed or keep a gun for home defense, when it's been sitting in the dust for 3 months and hasn't been cleaned, or if you've been carrying it and getting sweat on it in pocket lint or body hair or lint from your clothing. When these things happen, they get in your gun. And you don't have to carry it very long for this to happen. Carry a concealed handgun for a week and then field strip it, and you'll see what I mean. These things happen. And so producing a gun that functions reliably in those environments, those are the handguns that we want to put our lives' trust in. Now the good news is this: guns that are plenty reliable for this type of self-defense absolutely are out there. They exist, and there are a great number of them. And one of the quickest ways to determine a gun's quality and reliability is simply to look at the manufacturer. Who made that handgun? Out of all the manufacturers out there, there are only a few who make the majority of handguns that are used by police and military. And these manufacturers depend so much on these juicy contracts that they would never risk tarnishing the reputation with a substandard quality gun just to save a few bucks. And so most of these manufacturers simply will not make a gun that's not, as I say, combat reliable. And that is exactly what we want: combat reliability. And so the answer to this question becomes very simple. If you want a gun that is almost guaranteed to be combat reliable, look no further than the manufacturers who make the guns carried by police officers in the line of duty and by military personnel in the line of combat. These guns, with very few exceptions, are almost always going to be combat reliable. Now, I'm going to give you a list of guns that I believe are indeed combat reliable. This is not a complete list, and I just have to say I'm not involved with any of these companies, and I disclaim all guarantees like that. I don't have permission to name them or use their trademarks here. I'm just going to name them for your information. Tier 1 quality pistols include, but are not limited to, Glock, Beretta, CZ, Browning, Ed Brown, Les Baer, Smith & Wesson, H&K, Sig Sauer, Colt, Springfield, Dan Wesson, Walther, FN. Manufacturers that make mostly Tier 1 guns include Kimber, Fusion, Rock River Arms, Ruger, and Remington. Now, you'll notice that I've not named a couple of the more popular manufacturers. Manufacturers that produce mostly Tier 2 quality guns include Carr, Taurus, Berza, Keltec, Para, Magnum Research. Now, these guns in this second category are by no means bad. They're not junk. However, the simple fact of the matter is you would not find these guns in the holsters of police or military, people who have a very highly elevated chance of having to use their guns in combat compared to us. The reason is those guns in this second group are guns that are designed to meet our wants as private citizens. Again, the wanting the comfortable gun, the wanting a very lightweight gun, a thin gun, things like that. They're designed to meet our wants, whereas the combat reliable guns are designed to meet our needs. That's why I've separated gun manufacturers into 3 categories: Tier 1 handguns, Tier 2 handguns, and Tier 3 handguns. Tier 1 guns are the best. They are the handguns used by military and police. Most often, it's an entire manufacturer's weapons that fit into these tiers cleanly. In other cases, Some models from a manufacturer might be Tier 1 and some models might be Tier 2. Others might even be Tier 3. Now, I always recommend that anybody looking for a gun for concealed carry or home defense chooses one manufactured by a Tier 1 level company or a specific model that is actually carried by military or police. Tier 2 guns, which again, in my opinion, include manufacturers such as Taurus or Kel-Tec. Again, these are by no means junk. Many people carry them concealed, and they do have decent reliability records. It's just that objectively, they're not as durable or reliable as their Tier 1 handguns. And those individuals going into combat don't choose them for those reasons. Tier 2 handguns, like the Kel-Tecs or the Tauruses, these have one advantage over Tier 1 handguns, and that is their price. And if you're guaranteed to go into combat, I promise you, you're not going to be sacrificing on quality and reliability just to save $150 or $200. Now, the third tier category, or Tier 3 handguns, is reserved for those weapons that I consider to be junk. I'm not going to name these manufacturers because they could probably sue, but I'll leave it to you to fill in the blanks now that you know those that I place in the first two categories. Just know that for a gun to be worthy of trusting your life with, I feel that gun must be at least 99% reliable. And what that means is that if you can't even shoot 100 rounds from a gun without experiencing some type of malfunction, that gun is absolutely not worthy of trust. In my opinion, that gun is junk. Ideally, you would be able to shoot 1,000 rounds and only have one malfunction that entire time. That would mean that weapon is 99.9% reliable. Just keep in mind, reliability does come at a cost. Handguns that are highly reliable tend to be heavier, bulkier, and more expensive than less reliable guns. Essentially, the easier a gun gets to carry concealed, it's probably going to be less and less reliable. And so the lesson here is this. The first step to evaluating a handgun's quality is choosing one from a reputable manufacturer. The second most useful and fast way to provide you with a very accurate estimate of how reliable a handgun is going to be is simply its price, how much it costs. You see, in the United States, we have the advantage that we live in a more or less free economy. Now, the price of guns can be artificially inflated by political uncertainty, such as an impending anti-gun law or a pending election. But aside from those things, it's still mostly true in the gun industry that you get what you pay for. With that in mind, I'm just going to throw it out there that if a brand new gun costs you less than $400, it's probably not made with the sort of quality standards or materials that will result in a 99.9% reliable machine. Okay? Most Tier 1 handguns start out at the high $400 range. $490 is a popular price point, but it's very common for a good Tier 1 handgun to cost between $580 and $780. Now, there are limits. Not necessarily limits on quality and reliability, but limits on what is wise to spend. That's because guns that cost more than $800 are usually special production run weapons, or weapons that are highly customized to meet specific demands. But stick to those general guidelines. If a handgun costs less than $400, it's probably in the Tier 2 category and probably not technically combat reliable. Now, if a gun costs, $550, it's easy to say, I can't really afford that. Any gun's better than no gun. I'm just going to get one that costs $280 or $350. But try to remember this. Ammunition, even when it is cheap, you can quickly spend more on ammo than you will ever spend on your handgun. I know a lot of people who have shot $3,000 worth of ammunition over the last decade out of a $400 gun or a $280 gun. It's not hard to do. And so if we're going to spend that kind of money on ammunition, if we're going to spend that kind of money on training and education, a gun storage method, then just wait. Just wait until you can put another couple $100 with that and get a true Tier 1 combat grade gun. Especially because if you buy a gun for $280 and it's a Tier 2 gun and you're not happy with it and eventually you want to step up, now you're at a real disadvantage because that gun just lost 20% of its value simply by registering it in your name. So keep those general guidelines in mind. Quality is something we can't sacrifice on, and the price that you pay for that gun is a great measure of just how reliable that gun is probably going to be. Important note, if you're buying a used gun, these price guidelines change. It's important to remember these price guidelines only apply to brand new handguns. If we're looking at guns on the used market, you can assume that this $400 threshold is going to decrease by 20 to 25%. That's because a good Tier 1 combat gun loses maybe 20 to 25% of its value during the first half of its life cycle. And when you're talking about life cycles, I mean, a used Tier 1 handgun is almost always going to be a better option for you than a brand new Tier 2 handgun. And that's because a Tier 2 handgun is only good for sometimes as little as 3,000 rounds, but usually between 6,000 and 10,000 rounds. Whereas a Tier 1 combat grade handgun, they're over-engineered so much, these things are usually good for 20 or 40 or 80 or 100,000 rounds. Especially if you're willing to have a couple springs replaced, you're probably good for another 80,000 rounds. You'll never shoot that many rounds through your handgun, most likely. So keep that in mind. If you're on the used market, you can find a good combat grade handgun for as little as $280, usually between $350 and $400. Whereas if you're looking at a new gun, if it's anything less than $400, then I would probably assume they're using less quality parts, and that's going to put it in that at least a Tier 2 category. All that said, there are at least 3 situations in which the price tag of a gun is not going to give you an accurate idea of just how reliable that gun is going to be. First, you can't trust the price tag when that weapon is manufactured by a boutique shop. Some of these shops can spend a great deal of time and money making guns that are extremely small or catering to some other intricacy. And so they can be well above the $400 price tag for a new weapon, but still not be Tier 1 combat grade handguns. Second, you can't trust the price tag when that weapon is manufactured by a custom shop, where an engineer takes a relatively inexpensive handgun and spends several hours performing modifications to that gun to make it more attractive or more unique. Just because it's expensive doesn't mean necessarily that it's Tier 1. And third, as I mentioned, you can't trust the price tag to tell you reliability during price runs. Whether that price run is caused by a political situation or a natural disaster, the demand for handguns can spike virtually overnight, and so can their prices. In these situations, even the worst manufactured handgun can sell for the price of some of the industry's best made handguns in a calm market. Now you know how important quality is in a self-defense handgun, and now you know 2 of the most effective and efficient ways to judge a handgun's quality without actually taking it to the range and putting it through the paces. First, make sure you're purchasing that gun from a Tier 1 manufacturer, or if that manufacturer produces guns of several different quality grades, make sure that the specific model you're using is used by police officers or soldiers. And then you make sure that you're paying at least $400 for that gun if it's brand new. If it's anything less than that, it's probably not combat grade. All right, and right alongside handgun quality, we have to consider magazine quality. Why is that? Well, it's pretty simple. Your handgun can only be as reliable as the systems that go to feeding it. Okay, we're talking about the magazine and ammunition. Now we're going to talk about ammunition later, but the thing that you have to keep in mind right now is that having a gun that is combat reliable, but having a a magazine that is not going to help you. Your whole outfit is only going to be as reliable as the least reliable component. Okay, so we need to have a good handgun, a good magazine, and good ammunition. If those things happen, and if they're maintained well, then you're going to have the optimal reliability possible for that platform. So there's two things you got to really consider when you're looking at a magazine for your handgun. The first one is simply, is it a legitimate magazine for that handgun, or is it a knockoff magazine? So the deal here is that in the ideal situation, your magazines will always be manufactured by the same company that made the gun. Here we have a Dan Wesson Guardian 1911, a beautiful handgun. Magazine for it, if I was going to carry this gun concealed or even keep it for home defense, I would make sure the magazine was also manufactured by either Dan Wesson or a similar reputable company. Okay, 1911s are a little bit of the exception because there are so many top-tier 1911 manufacturers out there. Indeed, true to form, this one has the Dan Wesson logo on it. That is a magazine I would trust in that handgun. Okay, so you really have to look carefully at these when you're talking about more mass market tier 1 combat grade semi-automatic pistols, because for these pistols, the magazines that are manufactured by the same manufacturer as who made the gun are very expensive. Okay, they can become, depending on the gun you're using, they can be anywhere from $35 to $50. And so it becomes very appealing to buy magazines that were manufactured by an off-brand because they're usually in the $10 range. And so for the price of one magazine manufactured by Glock itself, I could get 3 magazines that were made in a place like Korea and have triple the magazines for the same investment. But it's not worth it. Just like it's not worth it to go with a lesser grade handgun to save $100 when we're talking about your life here, the life of your children or your spouse. It's not worth it to save some money to have more magazines. You'd be a lot better off having 2 magazines that function flawlessly than to have 6 magazines that may or may not function flawlessly. And the difference in reliability between brand name magazines and off-brand magazines is pretty substantial. So remember that. You have to pay as much attention when evaluating the quality of a magazine as you do when you're evaluating the quality of a handgun. Here I just have a quick example to show you. For the Glock, this magazine is a very expensive, probably $35 to $39 magazine manufactured for this Glock 19 by Glock. It has Glock's logo on what's known as the base plate, the bottom part of the magazine. However, it's almost indistinguishable from this magazine. They both say 9mm. They both have metal feed lips. They both very clearly have a polymer follower. They both have windows in the back that show you how much ammunition is remaining in the magazine. However, only this one has the Glock logo here and the Glock logo here. This one has no logo here, and on the bottom, it has a KCI logo. Okay? Now, that's important. It's important to take note of these things because, again, I have a lot of experience with off-brand magazines as I tested them, and they simply don't perform nearly as well. The Glock magazine, when it is full, it's very clear that it's full. The KCI, when it's technically full, when you have 15 rounds in this magazine, you can actually squeeze another one in. And so when you do that, when you overextend or hyperextend a spring on a magazine, that's when you run into feed problems later on down the road. The way springs are engineered, such as the spring in this Glock 19 magazine, provided they're never overextended or compressed too much, they will almost never wear out. You can almost get as many reliable feeds off of a brand name magazine that's never overloaded or overcompressed as you can off that handgun itself. However, if the spring is manufactured with sub-quality metal, or if you overfeed them because you don't realize what you're doing in an off-brand magazine, that's when you can develop feed issues after just a few hundred cycles. And so, again, make sure you're getting a brand name magazine. Now, the only other thing to consider is the age of that magazine. Now, I'm not talking about the spring age. That's a very popular misconception that springs in magazines wear out as quick as they do. They don't. Now, typically, I would probably replace my magazines every 10,000 cycles if you could ever keep track of that. But, after 10 years, I would almost certainly be rotating my magazines out and buying a new one. Whereas the handgun after 10 years will still look just about as good as the day you got it. But even when you have a brand name magazine, especially if it's made out of polymer, but even if it's made out of metal, you have to look for signs of wear and tear or excessive aging from the environment. So polymer can crack, metal can bend. So look for kinks or bends in your metal magazines. Look for cracks in your polymer magazines. Otherwise, if they don't show any signs of age, and if they feed reliably in your gun, then they're good to go. And it's as simple as that.